Again, the word process is very easily thrown around in academic studios, but process means nothing if it doesn't connect you to your work.
The founder of a multi-disciplinary architecture practice, architecture discipline, architect Akshat Bhatt. The studio's work spans through varied typologies from residential and retail interiors to large-scale public and commercial assignments. It is known that the outcome of every commission is determined by a series of design processes, and as a result, all their buildings are integrated from the conceptual framework to tactile experience.
Hi, good morning. I assume that you've studied a bit about what architecture discipline is and what the studio does before you attend this talk. But I will run you through briefly the foundation of the studio and then our current works, and then move on to focusing on hospitality works as such. And I'm going to correct my introduction a bit. I believe while the term multidisciplinary studio is used a lot these days, design studios, I believe, or architectural design studios were always multidisciplinary. Even if you look at Corbusier's studio, you design multiple things. You go from cities to buildings, to product, to furniture, and such. Because if you had a point of view, you'd have a point of view on almost everything. And such studios never did, and you could call them ateliers or what such, but they never really specialized in any one thing. And I think part of the objective of this talk would also be to dispel that one myth. I think because I think a lot of us are talking about sort of myopic single-ended focuses on our work. So you categorize a firm as a hospitality firm or a studio as a corporate office studio. While some may choose to do that for reasons that are entirely their own, we don't. We do all kinds of work. But yes, most of the work that comes out in the public domain is public access, which is hospitality. So it was a conscious decision for the studio to do work that was accessible to people at large. And you'll see through this how we arrived at that and why, for us at that time or till now, the best way to do high quality design work is to do it through hospitality. Screen share is on. So the studio is a 20 people practice, and it works around a few principles, the principles of people. So embracing people, embracing context, understanding environmental needs, understanding legibility and flexibility. Of this, I believe architecture has always been about people. Good architecture has always been about a response or a rejection of context. And all good architectural practice has been about the built environment and creating a healthy environment through our contributions. Now, this may be embraced or ignored based on what we see around us, because our cities aren't necessarily the nicest places to live. To that effect, we believe in a process, but we believe that the process has to link you to your work. It's unlike, I know again the word process is very easily thrown around in academic studios, but process means nothing if it doesn't connect you to your work, and if it doesn't connect, and that means it has to show in the result. And the process has to be so transparent that if you change one step in the process, it has an impact on the result of the project, right? Anyway, the studio has also been shown at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Mumbai and has won various commissions as such, including and commissions and awards and publications, including some from the Prime Minister's office for the design of the India Pavilion and the Make in India project. So we start with the belief that architects usually render a service. And I think that's become the norm, especially in our country nowadays, where most studios are actually engaged in doing high spec, high-end interior works and sort of putting an image together, and maybe a couple of corners for the interesting photo shoots. And that's that. But we like to engage as a studio in a more critical process, so that with the client, so that you together come up with something which is more memorable, and which is maybe more effective as a result. Our belief is that a project has to last 25 years to 35 years as a value system, which means you can build it as well as you want. And obviously it has to be very well built, but the overall conception of the project in terms of theoretical framework, in terms of the design intent, in terms of the design output, and the aesthetic quality has to be such that it lasts at least 3 generations. Now, this often in academia, the term critical intimacy is misunderstood as what is it that you're doing different, or what is it that you're doing, how is it that you're actually changing things. Well, I don't think critical intimacy is about change. I think critical intimacy is about removing the unnecessary to get to an architectural expression that is very direct, so it feels like a more evolved, maybe fresher, longer lasting expression, to which you obviously have to study the culture and climate and engage in the research. And most small studios are engaged in such research. And I think the next line, which is that you go from new buildings to old structures to city and product, is sort of used as a multidisciplinary description. But the fact is that you need to understand context, and you need to understand the place where you're building, the people that you're building for, and an overall process that's not only the process of construction, but also the process of conception, in order to sort of engage in a larger, more memorable conversation on architecture. So I started my work or my examination of architecture in '92 when I was 13 years old. And I also at that same time started music. So I think one of the things I'd like to also touch upon is how architecture discipline came to be, and how some of the, I think I can relate to a lot of the conversation that happens in architecture school and out of architecture school. And I'd like to sort of also, put those in context. So I'm not a religious person, but I'm a spiritual one, which means that I like to engage with things intensely, be it music or photography or or architecture now, right? And it was in '98, which was about 5 years after really sort of, and this was an architecture school. I started architecture school in '97. So this was my second year in architecture school, where I actually walked into a library for the first time and started looking at books. And I wasn't looking at history of architecture books. I was looking at, the architectural review, and I was looking at current architectural um, projects when I saw this small rooftop extension by Coop Himmelblau, which had kind of exploded all over the place. It was, a mock-up of it was made at the Architectural Association, and everybody was talking about it. And I realized that architecture could be a lot more than how we see it. And the energy of architecture, even at a smaller scale, even if you weren't doing a high-rise building, uh, could start dialogues which were well beyond the scale of the project. And then, as you say, you travel, because travel teaches you. So travel teaches you many things, be it traveling through your own country or traveling, through the rest of the world. There are things to learn. And I think that's part of what in academic studio is about, studying context or studying or doing outstation projects or such. I think the idea is to open your mind, to make you get off from your couch, to sort of understand how things can be done in very specifically unique manner, so that the outcome of each commission is contextual and is not just typecast into one kind of building. And eventually, of course, nobody gets to vote whether technology will change our lives. And I think we often now relate technology to a mobile phone and a laptop, or a video call. But I think technology also has to do with construction systems and planning systems. So here you see a layering in London where you see, Victorian brick buildings, you see steel and glass, and you see Renzo Piano's, Central St. Giles project right at the back, and you see how that has an effect. And if you also see the shard of glass, or you see the skyline at the back, you will see that, there are different tectonic and technological outcomes of buildings. And each one of these is actually a sign of its time, because cities are actually a layering of different eras. What remains of a particular era is the architecture of that era. So you see two different bridges, you see on the skyline different, or on the riverfront different eras of buildings that respond or reject each other. You see St. Paul's Cathedral, you see, the walkie-talkie, you see the shard of glass, and you see, the cheese grater, which is, that's Renzo Piano, that's Richard Rogers, that's Norman Foster, and that is, I keep forgetting the name. And you realize that there are intellectual cues in the built environment. So you need to react to it, because that's what feeds you. Essentially, most of our feeders are what we have around us in our room, in our homes, as we step out of the city. And this, the city is where we spend most of our time. So, and that's what our real feeder is. And we have to realize that mass production or creating human habitat has been dominated by manufacturing, right? So today you can build, since the 1930s, you can build in concrete, and it's cost effective because there's an industry set up to create reinforced steel and cement. And it is essentially the rigors of mass production that create, sort of revolutions in the world of construction and the world of architecture. And let's not forget, steel and glass have dominated this, or used to dominate it well before concrete. So they're actually materials which are older. So there's nothing significantly new that we're talking about right now in the world of architecture, except maybe carbon fiber and some hybrid materials. But what we do experience is the result of assembly lines and parts made customized for the building industry. And we have to negotiate it. We have to negotiate this idea of production and the idea of evolution, along with the notion of creating an extremely customized sort of form. So you've gone from construction being the outcome of slow craftsmanship to embracing the impact of high-tech design and manufacturing. This, by the way, is a reference image from Swatch, if you remember, or if you study it, you'll see Swatch was a company that actually saved the Swiss watchmaking industry, because they were being bombarded because people were buying inexpensive watches from the Japanese industry, which were actually digital and they were more precise. Uh, and that kind of referencing still remains, right? If we're all familiar with these, maybe some of you are not. The Apple iPod was a rage when I was growing up, and the Apple Watch became a rage since 2015. But they also had their genesis in the past. So if you study the works of Dieter Ram, you will see how much of an influence he is on Jonathan Ives and how these references become extremely relevant and continue to be relevant for our time. That's actually why you study history. So the point I made earlier, you must change, you must travel, because that allows you to change and you must travel in whichever way possible. But that doesn't mean you don't come back home. You do. With those references and with having worked abroad and worked in India for a while, I started architecture discipline out of a a typical base garage. I think that's become a common reference now ever since people have started studying the history of how Apple started. But you start after having established a point of view. So by the time I graduated from architecture school, I did have a point of view, but I think that point of view has to be honed. You have to work somewhere. You have to work with enough intensity, enough commitment, and enough depth, which means it's important to pick the first practice you really work with and stay there long enough. And I think and a lot of dialogue is actually typical of architecture and creative schools to say, oh, I want to experience a lot of things. And you need to experience a lot of things, but you need to anchor yourself somewhere, which means where are you learning your skill sets from? Where are you learning your value systems from? So picking your first studio, from where you intern, and more importantly, where you choose to remain for a few years after you graduate. And I think in today's day and age, if you have to make a valuable contribution, one realizes that that studio has to have been around long enough for it to make some. So it takes typically a decade to establish enough body in a studio's work and test the theoretical frameworks that the studio works on for it to be an established studio, for it to be doing various relevant things. So I think that's a pick, right? And I think a lot of students, a lot of young people tend to confuse the idea of travel, the idea of experiences and doing many things with being sort of rolling stones that don't sort of stay stable in one place. I think it is the ability to assimilate various references while you stay static in one place. So to be honest, I've actually only worked in 3 studios, and mine being the 4th, since the time I started my my architectural journey. Now the value systems remain, whether and these are sort of, for us, these are fundamental hygiene for anything that you may do, that you have to engage with sustainability. You have to engage with clean air, good amount of light, reduced energy consumption by using materials that don't off gas, that don't consume too much, be it embodied or imbibed, last long. You have recyclable water, or you work with water cycle and water cycle recyclability. You work with materials that have a certain life cycle, which means they're long lifespan or they're recyclable, and eventually they contribute to place because of the building. If your project just sticks out like a sore thumb, that does not mean it does not evolve. If it sticks out like a sore thumb over 20, 30 years, it's not going to contribute to place. So the trick often is to, while you do have to make a building which is a hoarding for itself, the trick is often to source local, to reduce manufacture, to reduce transportation, and to use materials that are high life cycle. Eventually, if you work with the age-old formula of a reduced time of construction and a prolonged time of use, a reduced cost of construction, and a reduced cost of maintenance over time, then you will have a physically successful project. But that does not mean you don't search for contemporary forms of expression. And I think a very good analogy for that is the Sagrada Familia. If you've studied that by Antonio Gaudi, what it was and what it has become in its new form. And that's a good example. This one reference is the Tijibao Cultural Center from Renzo Piano's building workshop in New Caledonia. And I think if you haven't studied it, you should look it up. It's a great building. So our first project was in 2003. This was not an architecture discipline project. But it was one of my first projects in hospitality. It was a small restaurant called Made in India at the Radisson. Someone's mic is on. Yeah, thank you. So it was a restaurant called Made in India at the Radisson in New Delhi. And this, the idea was we'd actually realized that the dining out or a lot of hospitality in India is about being decadent and sort of creating drama. So this had references from Indian calligraphy, from the idea of whales. This was the first time LED lights were used way back. We'd actually got a local manufacturer to develop LED lighting for us. And it wasn't even prevalent in the West when we did this because it allowed color change, it allowed intense coloring, there were fairly long life light fixtures, and we had various references. And we realized through that it's important that you don't always interpret a client's values in the literal sense. You must, and that's again what I mean about critical intimacy, that while you learn and you listen very closely to when a client is speaking, you must also be able to filter through it and contribute in a manner where it is effective for the outcome of their project or their business as such. Each project is not just about the glorification of the architectural studio or the architect per se. It's about creating a successful project at the end. What we found is through our processes, we end up creating projects that are not only successful for our clients, but they're also successful architecturally. So I'll sort of move into our first architecture discipline project. And we believe that return to tradition is a myth. Nobody ever achieves that. And our first project was a hotel project one of our first projects was a hotel project in Rajasthan, with the idea, and the composition was basically orchestrated around points, lines, and planes in a valley of Udaipur, which basically goes from being absolutely lush green to completely arid. So a huge change in seasons and everything in between. So this was a Ranakpur project. I think a lot has been written about it, but what the project did was use, a compositional grid, broke the compositional grid, and created, a single large hotel building, but also a resort-like composition over about 7 acres of land, in a very complex, programmatically complex space. So while people say hotels are challenging, hotels and hospitals are challenging because they're programmatically complex, we feel that there's enough liberty in them to create, or enough space in any building program to create unique architectural expressions. What the Ranakpur project does is it uses passive and active energy responses as well as an overall response to context and materials that are found at the site. So barring the steel and glass, all the stone that you see was mined at the site. And a lot of what is called quarry rubbish, which is rubbish material that comes out with stone chips that have been used to actually to create the building as such. A lot of traditional building techniques, such as using minimal concrete, spanning using stone, supplementing the span using steel trusses, using clear served and servant areas, and basically juxtaposing the light with the heavy, um, the glass with uh, the stone, is what Ranakpur became, the project Ranakpur became about. Um, through an intense series of drawing exercises, through using, these are 13, 14 odd meter tall spaces with very large ventilated roofs, but minimal steel sections. So we were actually using we were structurally, the building kind of plays a balancing act with a staircase that counterweighs what's going on inside. So everything is a sort of system that works, as opposed to multiple independent things to which are disconnected from each other and just sort of slapped on. It became a more complex architectural system with sort of buttresses to again reduce the amount of material consumed, to creating jalis, which I believe are now, using perforated sheets. We created a lot of jalis which are now all over the place. I think they've been copied a lot, or they've been used as a motif a lot now, over the last 7 years. So, and using a ventilated roof to actually create an air, to create an actively cooled ventilated roof. What we learned from here, we also actually developed a whole new air conditioning system that was using something called thermal storage, using a system called geothermal cooling, and displacement ventilation, all three or four of such, to create a very, very efficient 100% naturally ventilated building. That won the Emerson Cup for the first time for us. And the Emerson Award is for energy efficiency in buildings. And this was the first time a building in Rajasthan got such an award. I think what's also important to learn here is how some of these things, some of what we do becomes a victim of its own success, because the Jali motif became so widely copied and so widely replicated that people stop seeing this in the context of it being, a much more valuable, larger project, and often just look at the Jalis and say, oh, I've seen this before. Now, you've seen it before because it's been repeated everywhere else since, but this was really the first time it was done. So I think it's a bit like the Beatles, right? It's a success and a failure. Or if you sort of take that analogy for a popular song, right? That you listen to very often when you're growing up, but then you hate listening to as you grow older. Just heard it so many times. This was the first real time we used sun from different angles. So this is actually the west light, and we realized that we studied how natural light moves around, how it changes, how natural light is blue in the north, and how it's more orange towards the west, and how both can lend themselves to creating spatial characteristics. That's a diagram of how the displacement system works. We also believe that a lot of our architectural expression has to be clear. So these are air conditioning return air ducts, which sort of express themselves as architectural elements in space. Some of these motifs are repeated, but the idea is that when you start creating your distinct architectural elements and narratives, which is they also start telling a story. They start telling people who are experiencing the space to walk through, to sort of question it, because your eyes actually ask the first question, right? Your eyes are the first things that engage with your built environment. And then the narrative becomes more apparent. Sometimes you ask the question, sometimes you just sense it as different. It also creates a series of layering. So what we do often is do something called, we work with a system called, with a principle of relaxed detailing, which means you don't necessarily layer one thing into another. You don't hide services and construction systems below another, but you actually rationalize each one of them, make each one of them beautiful, detail them to the last logical step, and then actually layer them one over the other so that they can be seen. So as you can see here, you see the glass, you see the block works, you see where the concrete elements are, you see the air conditioning elements, and you see the glazing elements. And that logic continues with something called dissonance, where you break the space out with color, um, and that creates a certain form of expression. The cottages are such where the site was overturned because the site was fundamentally rubble, and this building actually had the floating foundation. Because the water table is just 1.5 foot from the ground surface, so the building hardly has a foundation, even though these buildings are actually 9 or 10 or 11 meters tall. And every monsoon, first there are solar collectors, of course, to collect heat and energy, and then the water sort of floods in, is collected uh, in the site itself. So this becomes a seasonal river. We didn't want to have the area flooded with lights, so we developed a lighting system so that everything bounces off these uh, awnings. You get basically a sense of the moonlight when you're walking through. It's completely reflected. There's no glare. At the same time, we were, and that's the other thing. We as a studio, and that's something I should have said earlier. We don't pitch. Very often studios tend to go to clients and say, give us work. We never do that. We let people come to us, while we focus our energies on our own work. We don't focus our energies on the business of architecture. Our focus is um, on the fundamental principles of architecture itself. And I think if architecture discipline is considered a successful practice, it is that once you do a few successful projects, um, people will gravitate towards those principles once they see the success of those principles. So towards the end of the Ranakpur project, we were asked to do a town hall for a city. This is a very different project in its expression. It's an extremely contemporary building in Bangalore, because it was for the launch or the introduction of a whole new city, which is a future city. So what would the future of urbanism be? And while that may remain the same, what is the future of architectural expression? This is a completely actively cooled building made of 3 layers of glass, steel. The span over here is 17 odd meters clear span. There's a suspended slab. There are laced columns which are extremely thin. You can read about this building on our website, or you can read about it on Arc Daily as well. Actually, most of these projects that you'll see it uses the same idea of perforated sheets, but uses them to create a different visual interference pattern, which is called a moire. So while you move across the building seems to be moving in itself, because the lighting or the shadow patterns are fairly dynamic. So the building is constantly changing in its visual appearance. Here again, the material is a long life cycle. We used aircraft grade paint, a lot of quarry rubbish yet, and the building stays on a plinth with whatever's been mined all around the city. But the fundamental principles of architecture remain the same. Of using long lifespan material, of using local material as much as possible, of using recyclable materials, of creating an architectural expression that is contemporary, is futuristic, asks or engages you with some sense of curiosity, so that the building becomes dynamic without relying on too much gimmickry, right? And you see here again, there is always a sense of jugglery with structure. So these are 17-meter clear span. The building's 105 meters long, yet you see the structure is very, very light but robust. You see how ceilings and elements float through. I think this was also a project way back in 2012. So this is now almost a decade old. And again, displacement ventilation systems and such. This is natural light. This is not artificial light. And the red egg is an auditorium. At that time, the entire building was powered by solar panels, with an energy storage system right here, with all recycled water, which was all rainwater runoff from the building itself. We're also doing schools, but I think the next slide should have been this, which is that often when you do something so unconventional, you also have to think about methods of communicating it. So we used a cartograph, and we used a cartographer from England to actually communicate the idea of the township, communicate the idea of the Discovery Center, what it does, what it has to be, and what a future urban scape should and could be like, as opposed to creating just glossy 3D renders. Um, this is a school. I'm going to skip that. We also create sometimes pop-ups. So this was when the Beetle was launched in India in 2010. They asked us to design something. This was in Bombay at the Mahalakshmi racecourse that we designed a circus tent for the launch of the Beetle. We also do public pop-ups and such, which are kiosks. I'm going to ignore that. And then in 2015, we were approached by the Prime Minister's office to do a pavilion because Make in India was a new program, and the Chancellor of Germany and the Prime Minister of India at that time were to launch this new program internationally. So we were asked to design the pavilion. This pavilion was done in was designed 9 days. It's 17,000 square feet. 9 days, just two people along with me, and it was built in 22 days to the highest spec, right? So every possible challenge, and I think sometimes, or actually more often than not, one of the objectives or one of the challenges in architecture practice is that you are thrown a lot of constraints, and you will see that often people talk about limitations, constraints, how difficult it is to work with a particular kind of client, especially say the government. But what you have to overcome in your process is to turn all those limitations on their head to come out with something unique. So for us, this was the first time we were working with the government, and we were thrown that challenge to say, listen, we know you've never done this before, and we know this is hard for you. This is going to be very difficult, but it's also a big risk we are taking by giving a practice like yours this kind of work. But we've heard you are one of the best at this, and we need to put our best foot forward for the rest of the world. Let's not forget that in these 9 days also, industrial policy keeps changing. Each policy, each component of a national policy changes every day, and you cannot communicate that incorrectly. There were changes happening till 1 hour before the inauguration, and those are national policy level changes. So you need to be able to embrace those and communicate those. I think the reason we've got this project out here is because it was a significant project for us. It was probably one of the biggest challenges we overcame successfully. And C, to say that no client is difficult. It's only as difficult as you sort of as the limitations you sort of put on yourself. I don't think we're showing this today, but I'm showing the Mohalla clinics today. But if you search for the Mohalla clinics in Delhi, you'll see that we've also recently done these clinics out of containers for the government of Delhi. And now we're being approached with governments all over the world for similar solutions. Now, well, I'm not going to get into the planning of the India Pavilion. You will find this online, but you'll see that for something which is known to be an exhibition, this is actually an extremely customized, very, very bespoke build, and it was done in record time by a small studio at that time. We were just 9 people, and all I could do was spare 2 people to work on this pavilion at the time, to also creating icons which are now national icons, to the level of sculptures and with variations. It was all done in 9 days, including exhibitions of how a smart city should be, what the smart city planning is for India across the entire country, for how the policy will determine the outcome for what a future Chandigarh could be, to what our future street sections would be like, and such. We're also doing some high-rise projects in Mumbai. This is, a proposal for a tower at Nariman Point, which is probably the tallest building in India, and it's an office complex. But that brings me to our other engagement, or our most intense engagement, which is hospitality. Hospitality because it moves, because the outcome is checked in public domain very quickly, which means there are unpredictable users, or your user base is unpredictable. So your communication has to be very strong. Incidentally, the first hospitality project we did after Ranakpur uh, and the Radisson project was, well, the Radisson project was in 2004, and the Ranakpur project was in 2010 or 11. And this was a project in 2017. So it's not, so there was a 7-year gap before we did another hospitality project. And this is was an adaptive reuse / conservation project. This is in one of the oldest hotels in the country. It's nearly 200 years old. It's the Oberoi Grand at Calcutta, where we are refurbishing everything. So the first part of the strategy was, what do you refurbish first? And the first thing we said was, let's announce the change by doing the main restaurant, and because the building has such a history, it was involved in the Second World War. It was it's an icon. It's still considered a cultural icon, or a celebratory icon by the people of Calcutta. So we had to sort of uh, embrace that. It's seen as a marquee architectural landmark. It's a grade 1 listed building, which means you can't do too much. We were, well, again, with a series of challenges and limitations, we were thrown into this. What the project, by the way, is an assembly. It's a construction assembly, where while the building is in Calcutta, the interior was entirely crafted out of factories near Delhi and shipped and assembled as a kit of parts. So everything that you see here was fabricated in Delhi as a kit of parts and has been just pretty much knocked out, because it was impossible to do the physical build as well as the physical build for the interior and the strengthening, retrofitting of the services and the existing structure at the site at the same time. Remember, this is an operating hotel. It's one of the busiest hotels in Calcutta. So you can't really shut down. You can't really make too much of a noise. And yet, when you do an Oberoi-like project, which was one of our learnings in hospitality, that, there's really the only client we felt in India that had the vision uh, to understand that design and architecture has to last a few generations before it should be refreshed or should need change. And I really mean that. If you look at most of the houses that people live in, they are 3-generation houses before they're brought down. And I think that's something that we as architects have forgotten. And that's contributing to the kind of environmental disasters we are seeing. And the building industry is a large contributor to it. So for this particular project, we took references of the built history of the project. We scanned and 3D scanned multiple elements. We rationalized them using using computation, and they were then further rationalized into construction systems, into scale and rhythm, into sort of into polyrhythms, where you go from one layer to another layer to another layer. So you'll see that it's not one thing. There's enough variety in the space, but there's multiple repetitions of different rhythms. It's a bit like reggae music, and you sort of create a space with 650 unique works of art. And again, these terms that I'm throwing around are loosely thrown. They're only a fact, but they're not what makes the space. It's not the 650 pieces of art, distinct pieces of art, that make the space. It's the space onto itself. Each one of these elements contributes with a mobile that sort of is a little more high tech in appearance, adds a little bit of gliss and sort of dissonance to the space, another layer of and another juxtaposition and such. Everything that you see here was made in India. Everything that you see here, including light fixtures and the mobile, were all designed by the studio. Nothing was bought except the technical light fixtures and maybe the air conditioners. Right, and you always face challenges. So here's the bar at the other end, And while we were sort of breaking the bar and opening it out, we suddenly realized there's a 200-year-old column that supports steel column that supports 6 stories of the building above, which was never recorded in any of the as-built. So we had to come up with an intervention right then to create, and for what we did for that was create a wine story and a media console, so that um, we could embrace that within the architectural expression of the space. Most recently, we've also been asked to. We also just finished the renovation of the Oberoi Amar Villas, which is now a 20-year-old building, and this was finished during the pandemic. It was a 5-month renovation for the entire hotel. It's the only project that actually overlooks the Taj Mahal directly, and it was showing its age. So uh, we were asked to do well. So to start with, again, the public area, where we've done a series of prefabricated cross vaults with a minimal intervention. Like I said, there are some architectural projects, such as the contemporary ones, where the services are exposed and the services are the services are used to create an architectural narrative. In a building of this nature, the services, including the fire sprinkler systems, the lighting systems, all have to be there because these are public buildings. So they're technically very complex. But in this case, they're all hidden. So often when you go to a space, especially a restaurant with a large one, you'll see sprinklers, you'll see lights, you'll see AC grills. In here, you'll see nothing. And that's part of understanding and challenging a space to say, how do you do this? How do you create a space? How do you make it loftier? How do you make it feel larger, yet retain a sense of intimacy, um, create a cross-vaulted system, but have it feel fresh and contemporary and something that will remain relevant for the in the coming years, um, and create enough tactile quality in it for it to be engaging. So the cross-vaulted system was such that it would actually take, the apertures were designed such that they would take and amplify the sense of natural light and the loftiness of the space. There is enough craft in it. There's enough sense of craft, but the sense of craft actually comes from machining, not not from hand, and that becomes obvious in the sort of crisp, almost robotic expression of the space in itself. Um, I think this is a segue, and the segues into some of our corporate offices where, it sort of extends our philosophy of. This, by the way, is the corporate office for the chairman of the Oberoi Hotels, and it's about it. This sits in Gurgaon, so that's the context of Gurgaon. You see the expressway right there, but how do you create an island of excellence or a sort of island of peace and calm in a city as intense as Gurgaon? And I think that it's kind of also relevant to Bombay, where what can you do to actually get a sense of calm in a city which is so hypercharged? Um, and you'll see that there's a central courtyard. Again, everything here is designed by us: the rugs, the furniture, all crafted and made in India. But most important here is the overall sense of transparency for an office that actually requires a lot of privacy, and that comes through puncturing a courtyard, giving the 2 layers of glass. So only if you're walking through the corridor can you actually see what's going on. Otherwise, that's on the whole is it's a private space with a sort of island of calm and rooms that have privacy. Again, um, ceilings that go beyond coves, which are sort of which have diffuse lighting and such, but on the whole, services are kind of hidden and invisible. And to the other side, which is actually bang opposite the same, to create a project, an office for the projects development team, which is very different in its architectural expression, but similar in its values, where the space is more communal, more open-ended, still has a courtyard, but has a more sort of usable courtyard space, has a more open plan feel, yet has a sense of being high spec and luxury, or luxurious, uh, and has a sense of memory and has a sense of, sort of acknowledging engagement. So this is a 6 meter long aircraft wing we bought an aircraft and we chopped it up because the person who uses this office is actually an automobile and aircraft aficionado, and you're sitting right on top. This is the only thing that he has in the office, just one wing, and that's all the office was about. Where it was restored, um, so the office feels a little high tech and yet very well crafted. Um, there is no distraction in it. It is not unnecessarily opulent, but the space is engaging and and feels again luxurious because the ample natural light and loftiness in the space as such. Um, these are actually the mock-up. These are I'm segueing again, and these are I'm actually going to skip through these. This is still the Oberoi Calcutta, but we're also doing we've also done the Oberoi New Delhi, which is again the most marquee hospitality project that there is in Delhi. One of the most iconic properties in India. Um, again, everything here is made in India and designed by us. And these are the luxury suites where I think what's important is to understand how ergonomically clear a space has to be. What do you have to feel as an outsider in a space, because you're creating a space that is a room or a suite, and these are suites. What do you do? How do you create a space for somebody who's going to use it only for a few nights? For him, for the user, it must be instantly comfortable, like home, but it's not a space that they can customize uh, before they walk in to make it feel like home. So the art has to be in the right place. It has to be the right art. It has to be the right books. It has to be the right amount of sense of glamour without it being opulent. It has to make you feel positive when you wake up, and it has to make you and comfortable when you wake up, and instantly and comfortable and calm when you go to sleep. And I think a lot is done in hospitality, or a lot is overdone in the world of hospitality. I think this is an example of how a lot of restraint must be used to create spaces in India that are luxurious yet familiar and comfortable, long lasting, and enduring at the same time. Um, and it doesn't just have to be one expression, it can actually be two expressions. So while what you see here was a more 70s or 80s inspired Art Deco influence, what you see here is actually a more Victorian influence in the same space, but they're actually really the same space. They're actually very similarly laid out. It's just that the tools you use for expression are very different. So both the projects, which is the corporate office project for the Oberoi as well as the Oberoi New Delhi, demonstrate the same thing, that you can that you have to have that sort of versatility and skill within your value system to create architecture which is or design which is which is engaging for all kinds, right? So you want that sense of differentiation. um, these projects also, by the way, led us to the creation of a new brand. We were involved in creating the DNA and the fundamental workings of the postcard hotels, which started with using brownfield projects, which is because we believe that it's important to not ignore buildings of the past, which is what we learned from the Oberoi Calcutta and some of the other projects we've done as adaptive reuse projects and conservation projects in Jodhpur and such. So we started with taking 3 old buildings in Goa and refurbishing them, restoring them, adding some dissonant elements to create small format hotels. And this project was a project that we programmed. So we programmed before this, nobody had done absolute uh, 5-star luxury in just 9-room properties. Um, and this was an exercise in how do you conserve, yet how do you create an architectural language that has enough layering for contemporary use and for future use, wherein we collaborated with even fixture manufacturers or bathware manufacturers to actually create custom products for us. This is one of the oldest projects, one of the oldest surviving buildings, it's 350 years old in Goa, which became one such postcard hotel. And here we used a lot of what was old, what was new, what was old, and some of the things that were actually a lot of what is new created to make it look old and feel old with the same sort of, and that doesn't just look old, but actually performs in the same way. So the bed creaks when you sit on it, is extremely tall and such. To creating more bohemian spaces, to creating very, very high-tech construction on the seashore. This is the only hotel project on high tide line, on adjoining the sea in India that has been built in the last 25 years. It is a resort near Mangalore. It's built entirely of steel. It's prefabricated, but it's also layered with coconut rattan, which is a material that is prevalent in that region. Where this building sort of comes together, is put up on site with a minimal intervention. Within 2 months, you have a 22-room operating hotel. These are renders, but the project's very near completion now. To working well, of course, through sketches and Andamans and whatnot. I'm just going to run through this. This is a repeat. And yeah, I'm going to actually take questions now. If there are any, we have many more that we can keep talking about. This is, an Italian restaurant and such. Oh yeah, I can talk about this one as the last. This is, this, if you've seen the Oyo townhouses, we actually came up with them, and the first 3 were done abroad. And the idea was that the idea was to actually clean up our city through subterfuge, to take a brownfield project, to create a brand out of something that had nothing to do with the brand. And these are 3 distinct ones in London that I'm showing you, where we started with these, and then we created the catalog out of London. It then came into, they were brought into Delhi and then taken all over. I think there are a few in Bombay as well. But we created the catalog for the projects abroad, and then we exited and allowed them to use their team to create them. I think the product has been diluted, but that's not something that's not something that's happening in postcard. I think in postcard the product's actually becoming stronger. These are a few other engagements of sort of smaller hotels. This is in New Delhi. It's a completely prefabricated building that was built over 1 year, 30 odd rooms. All the rooms are made in a factory and sort of just plugged in, almost like containerized rooms. And we're doing larger formats of those as well, where a container becomes a plug-in module for a room. Right, I'm going to stop here. I'll take questions.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, for that wonderful presentation. And those were some really amazing projects. And I think the audience can start asking questions, and I would request them to keep their videos on while asking the questions if possible. And people joining in from Facebook Live can post their questions in the comments that will be conveyed to sir as well.
So, hello, sir. My question is actually regarding your project based in Bangalore. So, the auditorium space of the structure has a very fascinating egg-shaped form, but also furthermore, it has a very distinctive red-colored facade. So, the question is like, what measures were taken to get a dynamic structure such as that to get along with its like neighboring surrounding architecture, and what was the response of the society, like mainly the variety of users using the space?
So the auditorium is a 35 people auditorium. The form was arrived at through a series of acoustic and visual exercises, and it was finally resolved parametrically, but was crafted by hand. The color. It's red because when you sit in in a basic desolate surrounding, let's not forget that red is the longest wavelength, so you see it from a distance, right? So so this is a greenfield project, which means there was nothing in the surrounding, and you see, and you would basically need to create something that was easily visible, identifiable, trackable for people who are moving past in their cars at 120 kilometers an hour, and that's why the red. It also becomes a beacon eventually, and so it is high visibility, um, and it's been embraced so much so by people that let's not forget that you don't have to fit in. Every architectural project doesn't have to blend, and that was my point. The contrast is important. Juxtaposition is very important. So not every building should blend in and just sort of become brown like everything else. Um, so this is a building that stands out. This is a building that is a beacon. It is a hoarding. It is a sign. And over the years, what now happens there is even children. Uh, well, the Edinburgh Science Festival is hosted here. Rock concerts are hosted here. It becomes a backdrop for that because it's become this building has become an icon for the city of Bangalore. And you'll see that there are people who come here just to visit the building. Tell me, when was the last time you said, "Oh, this is an ordinary building and I want to visit it"? Right? Or when was the last time people say that? Or do you actually say, "Oh, this is a unique building and I want to visit it"? Now, that doesn't mean that every project has to be unique, that everything cannot be screaming for attention. So, and that's why studying context becomes important. So sometimes you have to be respectful. And I think if you look at some of James Sterling's work, especially the stat the Tate Britain, which James Sterling did, not what Herzog de Meuron did, is a great understanding of how do you extend something which has a naturally which has an old, very well established and charged context into something new, right? I think the quest for and what's very distinct in the studio is that there is a quest for new architecture and there is an embracing of old architecture, right? Because a building that exists is already built, it's sustainable, so it's probably easier to, in most cases than not, it's probably easier to retrofit it and continue using it for future use uh, as opposed to creating something which is absolutely new. That's in a brownfield context. In the case where something exists, but when something does not exist, you should create something. I believe you should create something that is architecture for the future. Does that answer your questions?
Yes, sir. Yes, I did. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, sir. Good morning. So I want to ask, like, architecture, it deals with designing spaces which are mostly comfortable and like they should even be functional and safe. And when we talk about safety, women's safety, it is an important concern. So could you give us some insights on how architecture and interiors they help respond to these concerns?
Well, look, I think there are some things which are beyond the domain of architecture. But if you create environments or built environments which are generally well lit, which are positive, transparent, and clear, you're creating a positive, policeable or self-policeable environment. And I think you should study self-policing when you talk about women's safety and generally safe built environments, right? Uh, Health and safety is one, uh, but sort of policing is a whole different conversation. But I think they are all fundamentally addressed when you stop creating architecture with nooks and crannies and clutters and cluttered spaces and dark spaces. And you'll see that I think most of our work does not have that. Most of our work strives for a certain kind of clarity and openness.
Hello, sir. This is Adishri Patil from second year. So I would like to ask a question about the facades. So how would the facade design and the other elements of facade help the building to be more energy efficient and at the same time provide a better interior environment?
I think you must understand that you have to I think you have to study what space needs transparency, what needs translucency, and what needs opacity, right? But in my understanding, most spaces will benefit from natural light. And so this is a generic, your question is a bit too vast and too generic for me to answer. But fundamentally, if you address the need for light, the need for air, and the need for privacy in a space, you will find that answer. In terms of energy efficiency, you can either deal with buildings which are with materials which increase time lag, which means the amount of time it takes for heat to penetrate, or you can work with an elevational system that cools itself, that responds very quickly to the environment. So the moment the sun goes down, it becomes cool, right? As long as you've dealt with air circulation, ventilation, you'll be fine.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yes, sir. I have one question. All of your projects have a very strong architectural language, and as student, when there is so much to be inspired by, can you tell us Can you tell us how can one derive inspiration from your projects, keeping in mind the context?
I think strong languages are the outcome of a series of processes. So if you want to, and I can't say that you should derive inspiration or not. If you find them inspiring, you will be inspired. What you can do is you can study them to understand them a little further, right? And there's, what we're fortunate with is that there's a lot of publication, journalistic, critical, and documentary for most of our works online, right? You'll find them between our own website and some popular architectural portals to sort of to understand the processes or the critical concerns that we had for making a project a certain way.
Okay, yes, sir. Also, I have one more question: is that in the 21st century, we what is the importance of the relationship between artists, architects, and craftsmen in the 21st century?
I don't think that that importance changes based on era. So each one has their own role, and sometimes those roles overlap. But I don't think an unnecessary amount of importance should be placed on art. I think a lot of that dialogue happens, and that's a very natural dialogue. You need to be sensitive to the culture of a space, and a space and a place must have, each place has its own culture, which is often documented through art and through literature, as such. Why is it that we don't, but does that mean you go pasting paintings all over the place and you start pasting poetry all over buildings? It doesn't, right? So you should be sort of, so I think you need to you can always use a myriad of references, right? You can use art, music, poetry, literature, politics, science as a reference.
Have a variety of ideas and suggestions that they wish to implement in the spaces that have been provided. So like while designing such spaces, how would an architect approach towards narrowing down this wants into an aesthetic and functional design?
think you need to, I think what's important is to listen to a client and to understand what is a relevant need and what is superfluous. You have to do that for yourself. You use the same filters. How you convince someone is entirely your skill set.
Yes, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Are there any more questions? I think not. I think with that, we can end today's session. So thank you so much, sir, for joining us today and for that wonderful presentation. And I would like to compliment the wonderful guitar collection in your background as well. It was, and the musical analogies that you made, they were really enjoyable. And would you like to say some concluding statements to end today's session?
No, I think you have to. I think you have to find your own path as students, but you have to do this. You have to engage in a certain direction of research. Make sure instinctively it is the right direction of research for you. Stick with it, and don't forget, as you grow older and as you graduate, find the right studios to work with. Ensure that the studios you work with are studios, and even only apply to the ones that you really want to work with. Stay there long enough, learn, because there's enough and more to learn, right? Ensure that that studio has enough depth in its work, enough systems in place, because as a profession, you're learning in this profession. Your learning never stops. So the fact is, your most intense learning happens for the first 20 years of your working life, and those, if you get to the right studio, you're actually going to be paid for learning what you would otherwise spend a lot of money on to do a master's program. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Good luck. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you everyone for joining in.
Thank you.